Welcome back to the Action for Happiness podcast series. And for this winter special edition, we're back on the road for our second Carpool podcast with the truly inspirational Jon Kabat-Zinn. To learn more about Jon, check out his two earlier podcasts we carried out together, as his story is remarkable and his contribution to the growth of mindfulness through his research and his stress reduction programs is on a global level. He is often called the father of modern day mindfulness and has become a dear friend of ours. I'm your host, Ski, and my good friend Will be co-hosting today.
Mindfulness is not a concept, it's a way of being, and it's a way of being in relationship to yourself. So in a way, it's a love affair. It's a radical act of sanity and love to actually be fully present in the only moment any of us ever get. Fear is just a natural part of being human, and again, it can be paralyzing or it can be actually an ally in developing a greater intimacy with experience and the range of human experience. Journalists often ask me, well, tell me in one word, what is mindfulness? Because everybody's talking about it. Just give me one word, for God's sake. And so I try to take that seriously, and I say, well, I can say it two different ways. One is that it's awareness. Mindfulness is awareness. You already have it.
Slight engine noise in the background, as to be expected in a carpool recording. The video starts quite dark, but as the journey to Heathrow goes on, we see London wake up to a lovely sunrise. Action for Happiness is a movement of people committed to building a happier and more caring society. Visit the website actionforhappiness.org/podcast for more episodes and to access the latest videos. Carpool podcast number 2 with you then. It was cool, like we did it the first time. That was the first time I've ever done a carpool podcast kind of thing. And it just ended up being so nice, and I thought, I've got to keep that up.
Yeah, well, it's a great idea, actually. It's a really wonderful idea. The friend's house was not full on Saturday, and you could have easily come as my guest. So next time, I'm going to be a lot more savvy about that.
Yeah. How many speakers were? Because this was the mindfulness in education.
Yeah. It was called the Future of Mindfulness in Education, put on by the Mindfulness, what they call the Mindfulness in Schools project. So MISP. And there were a lot of presenters. They had a very, very full program, and none of the presenters were weak. Everybody just thread the needle of what they were doing. So, and it was so spontaneously wonderful. It wasn't like contrived talks where people got up and just sort of talked at the audience. And there were kids there down to about the age of 7 or 8 who gave presentations, some with their parents sitting next to them, some with their teachers sitting next to them. And it was amazing, and funny, and just everything. It really brought the whole notion of why one would bring mindfulness into the classroom really, at a young age. Just brought it to life. I mean, it's just so self-evident that those are, skills that you need to learn. Skills for just kind of self-awareness, being in touch with your own interior experience. And there was a scientist there, sort of a pedagogue from, I guess you'd call him, or philosopher, I don't know what his background is, from Israel, who gave a whole presentation about how education really needs to be both inner as well as outer directed. And when you just do it in an outer directed fashion, it just isn't entirely authentic, because you're merely, exercising cognitive domains of learning, as opposed to the direct interior meaning of whatever it is that you're learning to your own life. And so that it was just very powerful. There was somebody there, a young guy there, who was a kind of app developer for mindfulness apps. And he spoke about the shadow side of app development and all the money involved and all of that kind of stuff. And at the same time, the need for scaling mindfulness, and that the only way to do it is in that way, but to do it or attempt to do it in ways that are just exploitative and, going after the big bucks of being successful on a digital platform.
Yeah, it's almost seemed like it's a bit taboo to try and generate money and profit.
Well, it is, and he spoke to that directly and talked about how the shadow side is that the investors don't really care about mindfulness; they just care about what's coming back to them in terms of profit.
Yeah.
And yet, at the same time, if you ignore that whole domain of what's happening in the world, you're missing out on tremendous possibilities. So the challenge is, how do you do this in a way that really has an ethical, foundation? Sure. And if a lot of money comes, how do you handle that money? What do you do with it to actually give it back to the society in a certain way? There was a woman there from Wales who was a school teacher, and then I think got handed a totally failing school and turned it around by bringing mindfulness into it.
Wow.
And she was like a total, sort of energy, transmitter. I mean, she was like so on fire. It was just beautiful because it was, again, so authentic.
Yeah.
There were women there a woman there from a charity. I don't even understand how English education works, but she was like in charge of 60 schools or something like that. And these are like public schools, what I guess government schools. I don't know how you put it, but and she was challenged, why haven't you rolled out mindfulness in these 60 schools? And she laid out in the most amazingly powerful way why she hadn't. And it's because she cares about the mindfulness so much that to do it prematurely and to do it in a way with totally lacking in resources would actually set it back, as opposed to having a 5-year plan, which she does, to actually develop it.
Yeah.
Could we turn up the heat a little bit? Or turn it off.
Yeah.
So, from one person to the next, Doug Worthen was there from the Middlesex School in Massachusetts, and I know Doug. He's friends with my son. He gave a phenomenal presentation, as did his wife, Jessica Morey, who does this program called IB Me, where she takes kids over the summer and runs mindfulness retreats for them in the wilderness and things like that.
Wow.
And talked about the effect that this has on the kids.
Yeah.
And then, but the high point of it all was that in between all the more professional presentations were the kids and their parents. And one woman and her 16-year-old daughter talked about this girl was at the Manchester bombing, at the concert when the bomb went off, and she was about to go into the tunnel, and then they stopped her because there were too many people in the tunnel or whatever, so it was like, and then her mother could not get word from her because the cell phones didn't work, and the mother talked so movingly about how her whole life was couched in anxiety from the time she was a little girl, and then all the things that happened around the birth of her daughter, and then what was going on with her daughter, and how mindfulness, actually developing a mindfulness practice herself, really helped her to begin to deal for the first time in her life with her own fears, many of which were incredibly well founded, including like my daughter's in there, and there's just been a bombing and she can't get word about her. So the two of them were incredible, and then there were these younger kids who were incredible, the teachers who were teaching these younger kids. I think everybody came away from the day feeling that mindfulness, developing sort of mindfulness programs in the schools is not a luxury, it's an absolute necessity to cultivate the next generation of engaged citizens, human beings, who really have what it takes to live effectively under these kinds of very stressful conditions in the world.
So, I mean, it is clear to make any kind of significant impact in the future generations that education is kind of where it needs to be taking place.
Well, yeah, because bringing mindfulness into the world in any kind of really profound way is going to be a multi-generational process, because we're really rebuilding, or cultivating aspects of human nature that arise naturally, but can be so much more profoundly embedded in our society if you expose kids to it early. I talked some about Richie's work in the Madison Public Schools with what they call the mindfulness-based compassion curriculum. No, mindfulness-based kindness curriculum. And they've already, put out studies showing that this has profound effects on the kids in terms of pro-social behaviors, social-emotional well-being, as well as performance on the usual kinds of academic and behavioral parameters that schools care about so much.
Yeah.
So, and we're doing a 20-year study of the first teacher I know to bring mindfulness into the classroom, a woman named Cherry Hamrick in South Jordan, Utah, who took an MBSR program and then brought it into the classroom against my advice, actually, because I thought it would be totally misunderstood by that 99% Mormon community.
Yeah.
But she did it in such an effective way, and the kids in her class seemed so grounded that all the other teachers in the school wanted her to teach them mindfulness so that they could bring it into their classrooms. And the kids were teaching their siblings anyway, spontaneously, and their parents. So Cherry realized she had to teach the parents, which she did on her own time, and lots of parents came to it because they were interested, and their kids really seemed different because they were handling stress differently, and they were handling teasing differently, and the kind of inevitable stuff that goes on socially and in schools. And so now with Dave Vago, who's a young neuroscientist now at Vanderbilt, he used to be at Harvard, and some other colleagues at the University of Utah, we're doing a 20-year follow-up on these kids who are now adults and having babies and real jobs, and so to see what exposure in the early years actually might do in terms of all sorts of parameters, life parameters, just including income, how much money you're making. So I can't really, the data is still being analyzed, so I can't really speak to that at the moment, except to say there seem to be very interesting differences, functional and differences between the population who were in her class, Cherry Hamrick's class, and the kids in the school who served as the control. So it's just a very, and then Richie makes the point, and I've been emphasizing it a lot myself, that developing these kinds of skills of self-regulation and self-awareness and seeing and being able to be aware of the emotional sort of condition of other people and to empathize with them and cultivate, one's own natural tendency for empathy and kindness and with other people's suffering. He emphasizes, and I think it's very true, that because of neuroplastic changes in the early years, that it's like language acquisition. If you don't actually get exposed to a constant flow of language in your life and in your ears and in everything else, you never can fully acquire language, your own native language.
Yeah.
and it's these horrible cases of feral children who were, for whatever reasons we don't need to go into, were not exposed to human language of that kind and exchange, then they never can develop it. And neuroplasticity, as you get older, has its limits, and it is functional right up until the day you die. You can lay down new neurons in certain regions like the hippocampus and so forth, but it's much better to do it in childhood. And the other thing is that children nowadays are really immersed in a sea of toxic stress from a very early age. And so another argument is that these windows of opportunity neurologically, the toxic stress actually sets kids back, because it also has its effects on the brain and on functional connectivity. But what it does, rather than enhance functional connectivity, it actually degrades connectivity, so that you have less biological capacity to actually live your life effectively with your full potential. So all of the sort of lines of evidence point to this being absolutely critical to teach kids to self-regulate through mindfulness, and that the potential payoffs for society are huge. And that's where it might interface with Action for Happiness, that if you want your society to be healthy, and I know Richard Layard and all those folks at Action for Happiness are concerned about how do you find metrics for a healthy society and a happy society. Well, the way you do it is by cultivating these kinds of intrinsic qualities in children by letting them exercise those muscles.
You're listening to the Action for Happiness podcast. On this Carpool episode, we speak with the father of modern mindfulness, the incredible Jon Kabat-Zinn. Of about 7 or 8 questions that were put up on the Facebook page.
Okay.
In anticipation. And
you said that this would be a great way for me to respond to.
Yeah, so Roy's going to read them out, then you can just freestyle.
Okay, that'd be great.
And there's 10 questions, so maybe you take 1 or 2 minutes per question.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we've got Nicholas, and he said...
We'll read out the full name.
Yeah, okay. Nicholas Outram. He wants to know, how can he deal with mindfulness or improve his ability to meditate? He finds himself it being difficult, and if it can be applicable to people in the high spectrum for being autistic.
Oh, well, that's a wonderful question, and thank you, Nicholas, for it. Let me start by saying that mindfulness is just difficult for all human beings. The only reason it's really worth doing is because it is actually so fundamental to our the quality of our life that it turns out that it's non-trivial and actually quite difficult to cultivate the discipline of regular practice, regular formal practice, especially when you're starting out, and maybe for the first 20 or 30 years. And so you have to have a long-term perspective, to intend from the beginning, and your intentions are very important. So if you intend to actually find your own way to drop in on yourself and inhabit your experience in the present moment, that's what the meditation practice really is. And whether it's sitting on the cushion or sitting on a chair or doing lying down meditation in bed, there are really a whole lot of different sort of formal ways that you can enter into it. And then if you find yourself or put yourself in a particular category, whether it's sort of somewhere on the autism spectrum or anything else, to actually just put out the welcome mat for how it is for you, and accept that you can simply, your awareness can simply hold whatever it is that's arising moment by moment by moment, and realize that that is the curriculum, whatever is arising, and your assignment, if you will, like Mission Impossible, if you choose to accept it, is to simply rest in awareness of what's arising in experience. Whether it's pleasant, whether it's unpleasant, or whether it's neutral, neither pleasant nor unpleasant. And notice how much your thinking mind is going to judge yourself, usually harshly, about not being up to the task, not being adequate. This can't possibly be what I'm supposed to be feeling. If only I were different, then I'd be a great meditator, but I can't really do this. It's so hard and it's so boring, and on and on and on. And please know, everybody has those kinds of experiences. Everybody. And it's not a problem. The challenge is, how will you be in relationship to your experience as it is? So good luck with that, because there's absolutely no reason that I know of that you can't, derive tremendous benefit from befriending yourself in that kind of a way, moment by moment by moment. And it really is a true befriending if you're authentically willing to just put out the welcome mat and not judge what's going on, or to notice how much you're judging what's going on and then not judge that you're judging it. So you can't weasel out of that one. There's no way to fail at this if you're kind with yourself.
Nicole Abbott, she's been teaching mind-body medicine courses to students now for the last decade, and she's experiencing that a lot of the students are skeptical, but cynical about mindfulness. They have often been introduced to mindfulness via the app, in school, friends, online, heard about the hype, found it doesn't work for them and lost interest, but fortunately come back to try my topic at university. The amount of cynicism and negativity to the concept of mindfulness was quite startling this year, and came independently from about 20 to 25% of the student cohort.
Wow.
On the one hand, it seems great that we have access to the free material, free online mindfulness courses, etc., but do we need experienced mentorship, scaffold programs, teachers that are experienced in the practice themselves? One of my friends has a great model for fads. He says that from fashion.
I mean, a great model
for fads.
Oh.
And he says that it goes from fizzle to flop, and she's concerned that is mindfulness in the fizzle stage. She would like to hope that the purity of the concept stays alive and well, but is wondering if this is possible.
Wow, what a phenomenal question, and how beautifully articulated.
She's very vocal on the Facebook.
Really?
Page. Yeah.
Well, hello to you. Tell me, what's her name again?
Nicole.
Nicole. Well, hello to you, Nicole, and thanks for being vocal, and thanks for being so articulate in expressing those kinds of concerns. I share them deeply, and I did not know, because I don't come in contact that much with people in that age group. So cynicism is already setting in about mindfulness. Been there, done that. It's so yesterday. It's so boring, maybe, or just not useful. And you're right. What you need are really authentic and embodied mindfulness teachers. I think if your first exposure to it is an app, that might have a shadow side or a downside to it, because no matter how good the voicing, no matter how present the person is in the voice, is still disembodied in an app. And mindfulness is all about relationality, how you are in relationship to your own inner and outer experience. And so there's no substitute for having sort of human contact. I know in many schools, I met with people at Stanford, they have a mindfulness club, and the students just support themselves by getting together, not online, but together in a room and practicing together, and then talking about their practice. If you have one friend, one Dharma friend who practices and who understands what they're doing, or has a strong motivation to keep it up and to read good books on mindfulness and Dharma, that can be a huge bulwark against all of this cynicism and rejection of something that really is not a concept in the first place. You use the word concept, but mindfulness is not a concept. It's a way of being, and it's a way of being in relationship to yourself. So in a way, it's a love affair. It's a radical act of sanity and love to actually be fully present in the only moment any of us ever get. So it's very hard to be cynical about something like that when what the real invitation is to be real. So, of course, a lot of people on the internet are not real and don't even use their own names, or you can be a dog on the internet, as they say. So I think that these are kind of very real but not fatal or lethal challenges to cultivating a mindfulness practice. And I would just wish you all the best in trying to, in some sense, counteract that, not by becoming argumentative or obstructive with people who don't see things the same way you do, but rather that you find your own way to be in wise relationship with the practice and live it, and your embodied presence is going to have effect on other people, because cynicism dissolves in the face of kindness and in the face of embodied wakefulness. It just kind of dissolves, because cynicism is its own form of suffering. It's a kind of thought pattern that denies a particular kind of potential value that can lead to greater well-being and satisfaction and profundity in the nature of your relationships with yourself and with other people. And if you care at all about being happy in your life, the cynical attitude, of course, that's very different from skepticism. Skepticism, I hope people are being skeptical about mindfulness. Excuse me. Open-minded skepticism is very, very powerful, but closed-minded skepticism, it's closed-minded, so it says it all, and closed-hearted as well.
So we've got Lisa Kritin, and she says, not sure if this is a question for Jon, but she's wondering, she's finding difficulty in that she's becoming mentally prepared for the challenges at hand, and she practices mindfulness meditation on a regular basis, but she still finds excessive levels of fear in coming up to new challenges, and she's wondering, even with being prepared, is there a way to reduce the amount of fear she's experiencing in taking on new challenges?
Again, thank you for this question. It's totally wonderful. Fear is just a natural part of being human, and again, it can be paralyzing, or it can be actually an ally in developing a greater intimacy with experience and the range of human experience. So the fear itself is not a problem. It's whether you're willing to actually, again, as I was saying, put the welcome mat out for fear, because guess what? It arose. So that then presents itself as part of the curriculum of the moment. And you can ask yourself, is my awareness of my fear, if you hold it in awareness, is the awareness of the fear afraid? And you may find that it is not afraid, that your awareness is kind of so much bigger than your fear, and it doesn't self-identify with the fear because there's no self to identify with. And then it becomes like a weather pattern in the mind, and it may be a recurrent weather pattern in the mind. A lot of us fall into sort of just endless anxiety for one reason or another. Often it's because of experiences in childhood or whatever. But I can tell you that I know thousands of people who have panic disorder and anxiety disorder and so forth, in studies, who come to the Center for Mindfulness and wind up liberating themselves from a lot of their chronic fear. So there's every reason to kind of be optimistic and to not make fear itself a frightening experience, but to instead investigate it as if it was just another impersonal phenomenon that was, in some sense, we were entrained into the habit of being afraid because we suspect that it will, in some sense, undermine our humanity. But fear is an intrinsic part of being human, And rather than undermine our humanity, we could think of it as an opportunity to actually profoundly develop our humanity. And in fact, I'll just say the meditation practice, in Sanskrit, the word is bhavana, which means development or cultivation. So mindfulness could be thought of as the cultivation of your own interior capacities that are intrinsic, but need a certain kind of development and cultivation and even protection, the way we protect the fields and the plants in the fields until they're hardy enough and large enough to grow on their own.
Yeah, the United States never made it into the World Cup, but this is an official England kit. But
Fantastic.
So England play their first game tonight of the World Cup.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I mean,
So you haven't got, you can, every time England play, perhaps you can wear it and show your support.
I will do that. I hear England needs all the support it can
Yeah,
get.
yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. You can put it back in there.
Thank you. Okay, that's lovely.
No worries.
Much appreciated.
Just don't forget. I had it with me last time. I wanted you to try it.
Oh, no
last time,
kidding.
and I
Okay,
just
well,
totally forgot.
what's 1 year among friends?
Yeah, well, I said, no, I mean, when I picked you up
Oh,
on
you
Monday,
mean just a couple of days ago?
I just made a joke with my wife, and I'm being so present, I forgot the present.
Right.
So,
Well, that's priceless.
yeah.
In and of itself, that's
Yes.
priceless. Mr. Mindful, Mr. Mindfulness, it's so easy to actually be mindless. And in fact, everybody listening should know that the first thing that you discover when you start to cultivate mindfulness, of course, is how mindless we are. How much our mind just has a life of its own, and it goes here and it goes there, and it's like we'll just do whatever it wants. Doesn't matter what you think, whoever you are, however you fit into that whole picture. And that's, of course, data. That's really important to know that everybody's mind's like that. It's like the Atlantic Ocean, it's in the nature of the Atlantic Ocean or the English Channel to wave, depending on the atmospheric conditions. And it's the same for the mind. It waves under different kinds of stormy conditions. But if you drop down, even in the midst of a storm, 20 or 30 meters, it's total calm. And that's true for human beings too, that even in the face of, what I call the full catastrophe of the human condition, under the worst of conditions, it is possible to actually drop in a way that you're not denying your fear or your tension or your anger or whatever it is, but you can hold it in a way that gives you a whole other dimension of intelligence to bring to bear at that moment where, people wind up in prison because they lose their mind in 1 second, pull the trigger, and then the rest of their life had to do with that one moment where they saw red or whatever, lost their mind. So, again, this is not about creating some kind of idiotic ideal about what a meditative human being should look like. We're not talking about anything like that. This is what it means to be fully human. How do we recover the full capacity for that? And one element of it is, so if you discover that when you start to practice mindfulness that mostly you're mindless, what that says is that you're beginning to have first-person direct intimate experience with what's called the default mode network, which means that every time we are told to do nothing, we default to thinking and generating narratives about our favorite subject, which is me, of course, myself. And then we get into judging how good I am, how not good I am, and so forth. And what mindfulness is doing, I think, although a lot more neuroscience will need to be developed, is it's actually retraining and restructuring the brain or driving functional connectivity to actually have mindfulness be the default mode, that we drop in to being awake and to not knowing what's going on and knowing that we don't know. Well, that's awareness and meta-awareness. That's the name we gave ourselves as a species, Homo sapiens sapiens, the species. It's not cognition and metacognition. It's the species that knows and knows that it knows, but it's that kind of non-conceptual or more than conceptual knowing that is intrinsic to our humanity, but for all sorts of evolutionary reasons, we haven't developed as much as we need to.
Okay, so in thinking about mindfulness going forward into the future, and as it's expanding within, say, business, what's needed to keep the integrity of the practice of the process as it evolves?
People with integrity. That's what's needed. People who actually practice. So this is the thing, is that mindfulness is not a good idea. It's not a philosophy. It's not a catechism, and it's not a new fad. It's very, very old. It's even older than Buddhism, but the Buddha managed to give the most elaborate and profound articulation of the power of mindfulness. And very often, mindfulness is spoken of as the heart of Buddhist meditation. So the most important thing is to actually practice and to be in touch with really good embodied teachers from whom you can sort of drink in, so to speak, the entire felt sense and embodied sense of a human being who cares enough about the present moment to not be completely adrift in the future and the past. And you know it immediately when you encounter somebody like that, and you feel good intuitively when you encounter somebody like that. And I'll tell you, there are plenty of those people around. You know what they're called? They're called children. And then we somehow squeeze it out of them or drive them into mind states like anxiety about the future and not being good enough and all of those kinds of things that are really just highly conditioned, programmed sort of ways of being more unconscious and not being in touch with the full dimensionality of your humanity. And that's what meditation does. It's exercising a muscle to bring you back in this moment with this breath. And it's not about having some kind of major insight or some special enlightenment experience that will make it so valuable that you'll invest all this time and energy. The enlightenment's right in this moment. The enlightenment, maybe if you stop thinking of enlightenment as enlightened people or some kind of special state that you will get, or even mindfulness as a special state, and begin to realize there are maybe more skillful to think of enlightening moments. And everybody can have an enlightening moment when we just get out of our own way and drop into awareness. That's it, okay? So through a first approximation, you don't need to build a big story around it or any story at all. Just live inside your awareness, and that will actually transform and heal everything all by itself. And then life becomes an ongoing adventure in learning and growing and healing and transformation, and then acting in the world with integrity on the basis of an ethical foundation, to first do no harm. We should have a Hippocratic oath for education, not just for medicine. And it should be embodied in medicine, as it often isn't in the institutions. Do lots of harm. So this is kind of the major challenge for us. There's no substitute for practicing yourself and taking responsibility for actually learning what you know you don't know by finding other people with kind of common interests and practicing with them, finding teachers that feel like for you they feel authentic and they're communicating or they're embodying something, and just hanging out with them and reading their books and listening to their podcasts and guided meditations. And there's more stuff out there now on the web than there ever has been ever on this planet. So there's no excuse. It's not like, I'd have to, go to India on foot, on a donkey, or something like that, and then live in a cave and have cold water dripping on my head and meditate. I mean, no, this never been more accessible. You don't have to leave your house, and you've got like infinite stuff available to you, but it requires the friendship element and feeling you're part of a community and you're not isolated, that there are other people that care about it is a very important part of it.
Beautiful.
Thanks, Jon.
You're welcome.
So when are you next back in town?
I don't know. As I said, I flew to Salzburg to lead a retreat there, which was just fantastic. And next year I'll go back to Salzburg. I don't know whether I'll stop off in England again. This is, but it's becoming something of a habit. Yeah. And of course I love it. And doing this podcast with you and just seeing you and now you will. I mean, I think this is just very cool. And I also want to say how much I appreciate your sort of, I don't know what the right verb is, but shepherding my Facebook group, or holding it and tending it, because I can't really respond to the questions on a regular basis.
Yeah.
But now that I've heard these questions, they're phenomenal. So let me just say one more thing to all the people that are asking questions on my Facebook group or page or whatever you're on, is that when all is said and done, rather than asking me or any other quote-unquote expert the answer to your questions, try asking yourself the question and listening deeply for your own response. And you're going to find that you're sitting on top of your own genius, your own luminosity of being, and a lot of the answers to your questions are going to come to you, but they may not come to you as cognitions or as thoughts or as information. They'll come to you as a feeling tone for what is wise action, what is wise livelihood, what is a wise way to live in this world. And then trust that, because that's coming out of something, that's coming out of your DNA, out of your deepest humanity. And if it's causing, if it's in the direction of well-being and kindness and compassion, you know you're going in the right direction. And if it's causing harm, and you can be mindful enough to know that you're actually creating casualties, whether it's yourself or other people, by your actions or even your thoughts and your speech, then examine that, right? Maybe write yourself a restraining order. That's not a wise direction to go in, and go in the other direction. And then life will become your meditation teacher. That's the real, again, bulwark against all this trivialization and commodification and the selling of mindfulness and the hyping of mindfulness. That's the real bulwark against it, is your own authenticity, your own life lived as if it really, 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 really mattered.
Yes.
And it does. And I like to say, more than you think. It does more than you think, and it does more than you can possibly think. Because thinking is not all that's cracked up to be. And if you're in a student or you're in education, please know that, a lot of educators are really beginning to reflect on that interior education, which is not merely the accumulation of information or even knowledge. And now knowledge, like all world information, is in some sense at our fingertips, although a lot of it's probably wrong. But there's no real reason to even accumulate knowledge unless it leads to understanding. And what is understanding? Well, understanding itself is to appreciate how everything is in relationship with everything else. That's mindfulness. And then that leads to wisdom. And that wisdom leads to liberation from misguided notions about who you are, because the personal pronouns are referring to something far deeper than what we usually construct as a narrative about me and my life. And when you see deeply into that and write yourself, in some sense, a restraining order, or it just evaporates on its own, then that's a moment of freedom. That's a moment of incredible creativity, because you're no longer shackled by your own, entrained habits of mind that just accumulate because our culture has really emphasized the outer accomplishment at the expense of who's doing all the accomplishing. The inner. And when there's no inner anymore, no outer anymore, no self, no other, in any kind of reified way, then you're really in touch with the full dimensionality, as I put it, of being human and deep interconnectedness. So the last thing I'll say is that journalists often ask me, well, tell me in one word, what is mindfulness? Because everybody's talking about it. Just give me one word, for God's sake. And so I try to take that seriously, and I say, well, I can say it two different ways. One is that it's awareness. Mindfulness is awareness. You already have it. You don't need to acquire it. What you need to acquire is access. You need to cultivate greater access to your awareness, because our default mode is just thinking and emoting all the time.
Yeah.
So one is awareness, or you could say, if you'll give me another word, pure awareness. 2 words. But the other is relationality. Okay? How you are in relationship to everything. How you experience itself. We say, I have a body. Who's saying that? Is it the body saying it? My mouth is mouthing the words. My mouth is part of my body. My tongue is part of my mouth. The air is coming out of it. When you start to trace it back, who the hell is doing that, and how? If it was up to me to actually know how to actually vocalize anything, I wouldn't be able to complete this sentence.
Yeah.
So that's a gift in a certain way. And it's like, well, is that part of Jon Kabat-Zinn or not? Yeah. Well, of course it is, and it's part of every single person on the planet. But we don't appreciate what miraculous beings we actually are. Yeah. So the meditation practice actually allows us to see this relationality, that who am I, in relationship to inner experience, outer experience, social experience, intellectual experience. There's no end to it. And then in the end, it's like pure awareness, pure embodied awareness.
Yeah.
Have fun, guys.
That's brilliant. And remember, if you'd like to help create a kinder and happier world, please get involved with Action for Happiness. You can join thousands of others who are spreading a bit more happiness in their homes, workplaces, schools, and local communities. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and follow to keep up to date with all our content. Find out more at actionforhappiness.org. Join the movement, be the change.